Hi everybody, this is Jeremy Benamy, the president and founder of JStreet, and welcome to our Google Hangout on Air regarding the current Gaza crisis. This is the second time we've used this technology in a way to connect with our supporters and convey our views and thinking in a more direct and personal way. So thank you very much for joining me. There are already several hundred people on the Hangout with us, and I expect more will be joining us. I want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible, and so throughout the broadcast we would be encouraging you to tweet your questions to the jstreet.org Twitter address. That's at jstreet.org, or to email your questions to info@jstreet.org. I'll probably give about 10 or 15 minutes worth of questions, comments at the outset, giving a little bit of a sense of JStreet's current reactions, as well as an analysis of the current situation and some of the things that JStreet is calling for right now. And then I'll open it up for whatever questions there are, and we'll go for as long as it takes. So thank you again for joining us. First of all, let me just say that it is extraordinarily important for all of us at JStreet to recognize at this moment that as we speak, it is now 10 o'clock or so in the region. Our friends, our family, our colleagues, for JStreet, many of them are in Tel Aviv or in and around Jerusalem. Some are there for the summer, some are there for a few weeks visiting, some live there and have family. It's very important for us to say to all those people that we are thinking of you, and this is a moment that we understand is incredibly difficult and tense and stressful, and we are deeply concerned, and our hearts and thoughts are with you. I was in Tel Aviv last week myself for the Haaretz Peace Conference. I was there during some of the sirens. We heard the explosions of the Iron Dome system, and we heard the rockets coming in. It is obviously far worse in the south than it is in Tel Aviv, where these things only happen a few times a day, and in the south of Israel, they're happening every, on average, 10 minutes per day. And this is something that many young people in the south of Israel have had to grow up with for their entire lives now for the last 8-10 years. And so our thoughts are definitely with the people there and all of our friends and colleagues. I also want to say up front that we recognize at this moment Israel's right to defend itself from these rockets and against the terrorism of Hamas. No matter what one's views are of the conflict and of the root causes of that conflict and the policy mistakes that have been made and the decisions that are taken at all times that we might wish were done differently, we have to be clear that we condemn Hamas, we condemn its mission to destroy Israel, and we condemn the use of terror and of rockets to carry out any form of political agenda. So that having been said, one of the things that JStreet has felt very, very strongly about is that the reaction to the present events needs to go beyond what I just said, which is the starting point for most American Jewish and pro-Israel organizations who are expressing their love and concern for the people of Israel and its right to defense. Our position, we expressed this on Friday in our statement on the current crisis, includes a series of very important ands that add context to the conflict and put our support for Israel into the framework of our broader views and our broader basic values. So first of all, we grieve not only for the people of Israel, we grieve for the families in Gaza who are losing children and whose lives are made simply impossible, not only by the current round of conflict, but by the conflict as a whole. And we condemn the racism and the intolerance and the incitement that comes from the Palestinian side towards Israel, and we condemn the racism and the intolerance and the calls for vengeance that come from the Israeli side as well, particularly in the wake of the kidnappings on the West Bank roughly a month ago. We would say, in addition, that it is really important at this moment to remember that ultimately, if the goal is real long-term security for the state and the people of Israel, that there will not be real security other than through an agreement that ends the conflict with the Palestinian people, that gives them freedom and independence, and ends the occupation that has been going on now for 47 years. And finally, there is no ultimately military solution to what is fundamentally a political conflict. If we want this cycle of violence to end, and I think everybody involved in J Street is in it because we feel so strongly that there has to be an end to this cycle of violence, ultimately there is not a military solution to this conflict, and there will have to be a political solution. So that's been J Street's reaction to the conflict and to the crisis so far. We have gotten very strong and positive feedback, and one of the things I'd like to ask everybody on this Hangout to do is to go to J Street's blog or dig up the email that you got from us with the statement and make sure to share it widely. Share it with your neighborhood listservs. Share it with your synagogue or church listservs. Share it with friends. Share it with families. We want people to see that there is more than one way to react in a pro-Israel, pro-peace context to the current crisis than simply a one-sided standing with Israel alone kind of view. That there can be an and, that there can be nuance. So please, as an outcome of this call, do share that statement from Friday as widely as possible. Second thing I wanted to do during this Hangout is to give you a little bit of a rundown on the situation, a little bit of our analysis as to what is going on, what's happened over the course of the last couple of months, and where we think that things are heading. First of all, it's really hard to look at the current crisis without putting it in the context of the breakdown of the diplomatic efforts of Secretary of State Kerry roughly 2.5 months ago. The Secretary of State warned, and we echoed those warnings at that time, that without diplomacy and without a diplomatic process going forward, the stage was going to be left to bad actors. There would be a vacuum, and those who would fill the vacuum in the absence of diplomacy would be looking to fuel the conflict and could set off a downward spiral of events. And that, sadly, is precisely what we've seen over the last 2.5 months. First thing that happened, and many of the things that have happened, have been events that were not part of any larger strategy, that were taken by actors outside of the diplomatic process and led to consequences that were unexpected. For instance, the Hamas-Fatah unity government was one of the first things that came out of the breakdown of the talks. From what we understand and what's been reported, Hamas surprised President Abbas by accepting terms for a unity arrangement that had been on the table for a number of months. And the timing caught Israel, Secretary of State Kerry, and President Abbas all by surprise, and added to a very bad atmosphere of mistrust that developed over a very quick period of time and scuttled any last chance of saving the negotiations. The unity government was followed not long after by the kidnapping, the awful, terrible kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenage boys by a Hamas-affiliated family and gang in Hebron that has had a track record of being a bad actor in the area and destabilizing the situation. It is not clear whether or not the kidnapping itself was ordered and authorized from any form of central command of Hamas, but whatever the exact relationship was, certainly Hamas ended up owning the kidnapping and all of the consequences that flowed from it. Then came the Israeli retaliation for the kidnapping. Over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks, the IDF and the Shin Bet took the opportunity to initiate a major operation on the West Bank that went far beyond a search and rescue operation and went to the Hamas infrastructure on the West Bank and attacked and arrested numerous Hamas activists and militants. It closed down many Hamas institutions and created an atmosphere in which Hamas itself then stepped in and felt the need to start to retaliate, leading to the escalation to rocket fire into Israel. At the same time as the Hamas was reacting and retaliating, a wave of racism and calls for revenge and vengeance were set off in Israeli society. leading to the killing of Mohammed Abu Qadir and also to other instances of violence and beatings, such as the beating of Mohammed's cousin by the Israeli police. The tensions rose, the violence escalated, the rockets became harder to control, and ultimately Israel decided that it needed to launch a military response, which began last Monday and Tuesday with the aerial campaign that we're now in the midst of. And so this cycle of violence and retribution and response that is leading us in an ever-escalating moment of crisis is where we are today. Hamas itself, in our opinion, is weaker than it has ever been. It is isolated from Syria and Iran, its former patrons. It is not connected any longer to Egypt and to the Muslim Brotherhood. It has very few friends in the region. Perhaps Qatar still has a relationship, but Hamas is a weakened actor that has very little to lose. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is essentially left on the sidelines in the course of this crisis. There's not much that he can do to stop the rockets. He looks weak to his own people versus the active resistance that now Hamas is engaged in. Prime Minister Netanyahu is politically trapped as well. He has those on his right who would like to see an even more decisive and stronger response militarily, and those from the military and the center-left who are saying that it would be a terrible mistake to go any further with the Gaza reaction. The Prime Minister so far has been holding the line, but it's not clear which way he's going to go. Egypt is not able to any longer play the interlocutor role that it has in the past in trying to broker a ceasefire, and the U.S.'s credibility has been damaged by the failure of the peace process and by the rest of the situation in the Middle East. So you have a series of much weakened actors from where they were during prior crises. Meanwhile, the IDF is running out of military targets. It's doing what it can from the air to try to prevent rocket fire, but clearly rockets are still being fired at the same pace and the same range as they were a week ago before the campaign started. So the campaign's military effectiveness is clearly somewhat limited, and we're coming to the point where militarily there isn't any further objective to what's currently being done, and there would need to be some form of ground invasion in order to take take more direct action against the sources of rocket fire. So the question now is, where do we go? For most of those of our friends on the ground, there's simply a sense of hopelessness, of despair, waiting for help from the outside to bring this to an end. And so J Street is calling, first and foremost, on the President and the Secretary of State to try to facilitate a cessation of hostilities at this point. The President offered that to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the phone call they had last Friday. Secretary of State Kerry is supposed to be organizing now a trip to the Middle East, potentially to go to Cairo as well as to Qatar, and we wholeheartedly support their efforts to intervene before a ground invasion starts, to find a way to bring these hostilities to an end and to return back to the status quo ante that we were in prior to this latest operation. So that's our first call, is on the U.S. Government. Our second call is on the American Jewish community. We are very, very concerned by the types of reactions that have come from some of the organized Jewish community, from some of the institutions, who have said, essentially, you're either with us or you're against us. It's us versus them, without the "and" that we're trying to add to the conversation. We would ask that the American Jewish community recognize the complexity of the situation, recognize that there is no military solution, and the need to discuss the deeper issues that are really at stake in this ongoing conflict, and not just the tit-for-tat violence that has happened over the course of the last week or the last 3 months. So we would urge that the only way to make forward progress, the only way out of this horrible spiral, is to have some understanding and some sense of the political background to this conflict, and to try to put a halt and to limit the amount of calls for anger and tribalism at a time like this that are not helpful for longer-run search for a way out. And finally, we want to echo the calls that are happening in Israel, particularly that we heard last week at the Haaretz Peace Conference from the opposition leader, Isaac Herzog, from the Justice Minister, Tzipi Livni, and they echoed the words of the late Prime Minister Rabin, who said that we have to fight terror as if there is no effort to achieve peace, and we have to try to achieve peace as if there is no terror. And so we support the position that Herzog and Livni and others have taken, which is that Israel has a right to defend itself against Hamas's rockets, against its terror, to take military action that is proportionate, only military action that is proportionate to the threat that Israel faces. But at the same time, we do support their call for renewed diplomacy and a renewed effort to find a two-state resolution to this conflict. My final word would be about Israeli politics, and to understand, as one looks at the situation today, that there is a political opposition in Israel, and there is the possibility of change. We are, in J Street, fully aware that there is a camp in Israel that is looking for a more hardline, right-of-center, us versus them future that is one state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And the majority of Israelis and the majority of Jews worldwide are in another camp. They want two states for two people and a political resolution to this conflict. Ultimately, the majority in Israel and the majority of the American Jewish community support that view. And we have a lot of work to do when this round of violence is over in trying to make sure that our view ultimately carries the day for the sake of the state of Israel, for the sake of the people of Israel, for the sake of the people, the Palestinian people, and for all of those in the region. So those are my opening remarks, and at this point I'm happy to take questions. As I said, there are going to be, you can tweet your questions to @jstreet.org. You can send questions by email to info@jstreet.org, and I will be handed questions on cards as they come in, and I'm happy to provide any answers. So I will just have to read these and answer them as I read them. Reports have just come in that Egypt has helped broker a ceasefire. Maybe not true, but how has Egypt's role changed? Well, I certainly hope that there's some truth to this. I don't have any idea whether or not that is the case. What I can say is that in November of 2012, the Egyptian role, particularly through Mohamed Morsi, who at that point was the president of Egypt and of course came from the Muslim Brotherhood, their role was absolutely critical in achieving that ceasefire, because Hamas is so closely allied to the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was a good relationship at that point between Egypt and Hamas, and there were things that Egypt could offer to Hamas as part of a ceasefire package. What's changed today is the fact that with President Sisi in charge of Egypt, who has just led a crackdown on the Brotherhood and is in fact dedicated to its destruction as a political force, it's not the same relationship anymore between Egypt and Hamas, obviously, and Egypt regards Hamas as part of the Brotherhood and part of what it is fighting. So Egypt's role is a lot more difficult. I do think it's very important that Egypt play a role in the potential for reaching a ceasefire, and I would be encouraged if that were the case, and maybe we'll hear more during the course of this broadcast. So the next question. How do you feel about the Haaretz conference being evacuated? So the Haaretz Peace Conference took place in a hotel in Tel Aviv last Tuesday during the first full day of the rocket attacks, and we had 3 sirens that day, 2 of which happened during the course of the conference. And the conference, the main hall was evacuated, but other meeting rooms that were being used right next door were actually bomb shelters, and so people simply moved from one room to the other, and the conference itself was not really evacuated. We simply moved from one room to another in order to be safe during the couple of minutes of the siren. What I feel is that being in that situation with the rockets actually falling on Tel Aviv, it only redoubles, for me personally, the incentive and the realization that the only way out of this round of violence is to end this conflict politically. And so for me, and I think for most of the people at the Haaretz Peace Conference. They went into the shelter, and they came right back out, went right back to work, because the work of trying to achieve peace, the work of trying to end this conflict, is what the ultimate response is to these rockets. There isn't, as I said earlier, a military response. There's only a political solution to this conflict, ultimately. All right, we have seen an MK call for a war on all Palestinians. Right-wing incitement is growing. Is J Street's current mission and tactics adequate to respond? Well, I will say that it is one of the most frightening developments in Israeli society to see the growth of the calls for incitement, to see the reaction to the kidnapping that ultimately culminated in that awful arson and murder of the young Palestinian boy. There are political leaders of Israel, and there are leaders in the Jewish community who are saying and doing things that, to my mind, are simply beyond the pale, that are out of line with Jewish values, that are not in Israel's best interest. And in terms of J Street's mission and our tactics, our mission and our tactics remain the same. We are going to be true to the values on which we were raised, and we are going to stand up and we're going to fight politically against these right-wingers. And it's, you know, there are right-wingers in Israel, and there's a right wing here in the United States of a very close lines. In fact, my remarks at the Haaretz conference were specifically on this topic, that the far right in Israel and the far right of the Jewish community here have a very strong relationship. They share funders, they share scholarship, they share institutions, they have exchanges back and forth. And I think the center and center-left of the Jewish community here and in Israel needs to develop a much stronger and closer relationship. We share a common heritage, we share a common background, a common set of interests, a common set of values, and I'd like to see us develop a closer working relationship between those of us here in the States and those in Israel who were, for instance, at the Haaretz Peace Conference. So this is a question that says, Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, we use missiles to defend civilians. Hamas uses civilians to protect missiles. How do you deal with such a terrorist group? Well, I think I said at the beginning that J Street is very clear in its absolute 100% condemnation of Hamas as a terror organization. And we absolutely, there's no justification for the firing of missiles on civilian targets indiscriminately. What even, I believe I read that the Palestinian ambassador to the UN made some remarks, or maybe it was the Palestinian representative to the Commission on Human Rights, did comment on the fact that when a terrorist group fires missiles indiscriminately at civilian centers, that is in itself a war crime. But at the same time, I think it's very important to recognize that when Israel does its best to target its bombs and its response against the Hamas rocket launchers and against the stockpiles of weapons, that those weapons and those launchers are being hidden and buried within areas where there are civilians, and civilians are getting killed as a result of how Hamas has set up its operations in Gaza. It's a very, very compact area with a hugely dense population, and civilians are losing their lives because of the fact that these rockets are being fired from within civilian areas, and people are dying who shouldn't be caught in the middle. And so we have to have compassion for the people of Israel who are under the rocket fire, and we have to have compassion for the children and the innocent civilians who are caught in the middle on the other side, and not to blame them for the war crimes that are being committed by Hamas. Do you think that the Palestinian Unity Government will survive this escalation? Should it? I find it very hard to believe that there will be any sense of unity on the back end of this conflict between Hamas and Fatah. You know, ultimately, in order for there to be peace, in order for there to be a resolution of this conflict, then the Palestinian territories in Gaza and on the West Bank will one day have to have the same political leadership. They will need to be united into one country, under one leader, with one as they said when the State of Israel was founded, under one gun, under one authority. That will have to happen. Whether you call it a unity deal or you call it coming back together as a political unit or however it's phrased, that is something that is absolutely essential to ultimately ending this conflict. So whether or not the Hamas movement and the Fatah political party and the PLO are able to ultimately figure out how to do that, or it happens down the line in some other way, I don't know. But it is something that is ultimately in the interest of all of those who are looking for a resolution to this conflict. Netanyahu's comments on not relinquishing the West Bank are very distressing. Has he abandoned two states? Well, I think that one of the questions one can have, out of the entirety of this whole last year is a real honest discussion over whether or not the current prime minister and his government were capable of leading the way to a two-state solution in the first place. So the comments on Friday I don't think are necessarily any less of a reason to worry than the entirety of the last year or the policies that are advocated by this government. The bottom line is, for there to be a resolution of this conflict, there will have to be some political change in Israel. There will have to be a different government. There will have to be a different leadership that actually is willing to put a stop to the growth of settlements, particularly in the areas that go beyond areas that are likely to be kept in a two-state deal. There will have to be a government that is willing to talk openly and honestly to the people about the need to establish a capital for a new state of Palestine in the eastern neighborhoods, the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem. So there's going to have to be a different leadership and a different political frame in Israel for there to be a two-state solution. These comments, I think, fit very well with the tone and the tenor of the parts of the government on the right in the coalition, whether it's the Settler Party or parts of Likud, who give us no confidence that they are in any way a partner for a two-state solution. Given yet another failure of the peace process, isn't it time to admit the only answer is one state? Doing this kind of a hangout and reading these live on air, it's kind of like just reading the comment train on our Facebook page or in other places out loud. No, J Street does not now and never will support one state. To us, one state is in fact the problem that we're trying to solve. The only solution to the conflict between two peoples over this one piece of land, and we're seeing the conflict at one of its worst points right now, the only resolution is the division of that land into two political entities. If you keep the people together, 12 million people in one geographic entity, and they continue to fight, the bloodshed and the violence and the horror is going to be even worse than it is today. So no, the current violence, the current breakdown of the peace process only is further evidence that the only way out of this is a division of the land into two states, and so J Street is not going to change that fundamental part of its views. Does this crisis indicate a need to rethink the Gaza siege? Well, the Gaza siege back in 2010 or 2012 was very different from what's happened over the last 12 to 24 months. We came out very strongly in favor of relaxing the conditions under which goods could get into Gaza, to limit it only to those things that could be used for military or for terror purposes, and that all other goods and assistance should be allowed in. Basically, the rules had changed over the last few years for that to be the rule. It is clear that there continues to be a flow of weaponry, a flow of material into Gaza that is being used, obviously, to create the arsenal that Hamas has today. And so as long as that continues to be the case, then Israel is justified in its continued security checks of anything that's going into Gaza to ensure that more rockets and more sophisticated technology aren't getting in. But at the same time, humanitarian needs need to be met. Electricity should be provided. Water should be provided. The plants that clean the sewage and make sure there is potable drinking water should be fixed. The materials for building schools should be allowed. That's those kinds of humanitarian needs need to be met while ensuring Israel's security needs are met as well. All right, which is a bigger threat to prospects for peace, Hamas or Israel's far right? Well, I mean, there's no equivalence, and I refuse to get engaged in any kind of an equivalence. The Hamas, I've already stated, is a terror organization. It fires rockets. It uses violence. It engages in completely out of the, over the line tactics that are absolutely to be condemned. So let's just not put anybody in the same category as anybody else. So Hamas is one thing. It needs to be condemned. It should be fought. Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas. I think that the ideology that is being pursued by Israel's far right is itself also causing a threat to Israel's long-term survival. And I'm not drawing an equivalence, and don't mean to imply that there is one. But Israel as a democracy, Israel as a national home of the Jewish people, if it follows the philosophy of the far right on its political spectrum, members of the government today, members of the Knesset, if it were to follow the route of Naftali Bennett, of the Bayit HaYehudi, of other members of the Likud party, Israel, over the long run, will cease to exist as a Jewish and a democratic home. It will become further and further isolated in the international community. It will never be accepted into its region. It will never have defined borders. And to me, that is potentially the death of the entire enterprise of creating a national home of the Jewish people. So the ideology, the politics, the ideas of those on the farthest right of the Israeli political spectrum are ultimately, essentially, a formula for national suicide. That's a completely different form of threat, of course, from a terror organization that is firing rockets and trying to kill people using terror and violence. Wouldn't Israel's total destruction of Hamas help the two-state solution? Why suggest restraint? Well, the two-state solution, for it to ultimately happen, will require the defeat of the extremist factions and forces within Palestinian society and the establishment of a clear authority by the Palestinian government, by today what is the Palestinian Authority, and by its security forces over those who are threatening terror. And that's an absolute prerequisite for a two-state solution. So the defeat of the military wing of Hamas, the defeat of the Islamic Jihad, the defeat of groups far to the more extreme of those who are using rockets and terror and violence is a prerequisite for achieving stability and security in a two-state solution. But restraint is absolutely critical. Israel's international legitimacy depends on using the amount of force that is necessary to meet and to beat back the threat that it faces. And at the moment, what Israel is trying to do in attacking and taking out the launching sites, in attacking the storage of the rockets, those are the kinds of more proportionate actions that the international community has not come out to condemn, that is not crossing the line as of this moment. Now, the level of death and the level of civilian casualty, I just have to say, is absolutely horrible. And again, I want to re-emphasize that for J Street, and we urge the Jewish community to express our sadness and our compassion. But if Hamas would stop firing the rockets tonight, if there were no more firing, Israel's government has said very clearly that quiet would be met with quiet. And so the most effective thing that could happen tonight to stop the suffering of Palestinian civilians would be for the Hamas to stop firing its rockets. So I suggest restraint because it's inappropriate to go further. We believe a proportionate response is what Israel should engage in, and to do anything more would go outside of our sense of Israel's values and its own self-interest. How can we address growing anti-Semitism each time Israel does something militarily? The anti-Semitism in the world today is on the rise. Anti-Semitism is a disease that has been around for centuries and millennia, and it predates obviously the State of Israel and its actions are not the cause of anti-Semitism, which is a deep-rooted, unfortunate and terrible sickness that has been around way longer than the state. However, the actions of the policies of the results of those policies of the State of Israel do add fuel to the fire, and it is important that the State of Israel understand that its actions do have consequences for all Jews living around the world. And when we see anti-Semitic incidents such as we saw in Paris, and we condemn them unequivocally, we have to understand that they go up at moments like this. They go up at moments of tension. And to the extent that tension can be ratcheted down, to the extent that we can see a political resolution to this conflict, the flames of anti-Semitism will be lowered as well. It's never going to be extinguished. We have to fight racism and hatred and prejudice all across the board, within our own ranks as well as outside of our ranks directed against the Jewish people. But we have to understand there is a cyclical relationship here between actions and the response. So this is a very good question, which is how do we discuss these issues civilly in our congregations, and how do we start the conversation? It really requires leadership, and it's a question often of the rabbis in various different congregations. It is a question of the presidents of the synagogue. I think it is very, very important that at times like this, communities have the ability to come together as people who recognize that they will have different points of view, that they're going to disagree, that these are very difficult and important and sensitive topics. I think that the place for these conversations to take place within the community is so important, whether it is in a place that has a secular outlook or it's a place that has a religious feel. But wherever it is, the American Jewish community and its institutions should be welcoming of all points of view, and understanding that people are going to disagree. And one of the things that shouldn't happen out of this is the creation of any sort of litmus tests of who gets to be in the conversation and who doesn't based on what they say. And I think that's one of the more dangerous trends that I see in the Jewish community, is this notion that somehow if you say certain things, well then we're writing you out of the community, we're saying you no longer have standing to be heard. And I hope that that is something that we can reverse so that we can have that kind of a civil and an open conversation. I can just remind you, I see that we've got only a couple of questions left. If you want to ask a question, please email it to info@jstreet.org or tweet us at @jstreet.org. And we'll see if we can get through all the questions before the hour is up. What would you hope for if you were a Palestinian? That is a very good question. Freedom, dignity, self-determination, the ability to raise my kids in peace and quiet so that they have a chance for opportunity, a chance to grow up and have their own families in a way that other kids around the world are able to have. I don't think any Palestinian parent that I've ever met wants anything different for their children than I want for mine, and that my Israeli friends want for their children. And I think what we can hope for, both as Palestinians and as Israelis and as people around the world who care about the people of this that are caught up in this conflict, we can hope for the leadership that will stand up and tell people what it's really going to take to end this conflict. There has been a real lack of leadership on both sides, and there has been, I think, a precious little preparation of the people on either side for what it's really going to take to resolve this conflict. And so what I would hope for is that opportunity to lead a normal life like everybody else wants all around the world, no matter their race, religion, or background. And what I would really hope for is the leadership that will make it possible to be able to get there. How has media coverage made working for peace easier or harder? Well, I think one of the things that is so different today and as opposed to, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years ago is the proliferation of media sources. I think that on the one hand, it has probably stoked the fires a bit of people on the extremes. I think that the ability to watch only a news channel that agrees with you and follow only news feeds and Twitter feeds and Facebook pages that you agree with makes people harden into their positions and sort of self-reinforces that they're correct if they never hear the voices from the other side. And I think that the loss of a sort of a common thread that we all watch the nightly news, or that we all watch the same news sources and are operating out of a common set of facts, that loss explains not only some of the polarization on this issue, but it certainly is playing a factor in the more polarized politics in the United States. So I think the changing nature of media and the role of social media over the last 10 or 20 years, on the one hand, it's very helpful because it allows more views to get out and more people to be heard. But on the other hand, I think it has forced people into their camps and made things more extreme. Do you think that Israel's response thus far has been proportional? Does Israel have options given that Hamas hides munitions in civilian areas? Well, I do think that by not going in on the ground so far, that Israel has exercised some level of restraint. There are occasions where for instance, I read that the police chief's home in Gaza was bombed and there were 20 or so civilians that were killed. Whether or not it is correct to go after people at their homes is a question in my mind. I think to go after a launch site, to go after a storage site for rockets, to go after the offices and the places where things are being planned. Now, if they're being planned in a home, if the rockets are being stored in a home, then that home has been made a fair game, has been put into play. And we don't know enough to know whether, what exactly is happening in all the different places. But I will say that by holding back from a ground invasion, by providing at least some level of warning, Israel is doing what it can in the context of an awful war to try to minimize the civilian losses that have happened, not as effectively as one might hope and not as effectively as we might wish them to be, but I do think that there are efforts being made, and I do think the fact that these things are being hidden in civilian areas is what's opening up the door to this problem in the first place. Until Hamas reforms or is destroyed, shouldn't we aim for a state in the West Bank first? Well, that has always been the position that J Street took up until the most recent round of efforts to try to get the two pieces reunified. We always said, well, as long as you have a government you can deal with on the West Bank, then yes, the focus of the negotiation should have been with the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO on the West Bank, create an actual peace, create an agreement that provides Palestinians with independence and with opportunity, and show them that there is a benefit to being a moderate, to engaging in diplomacy, to pursuing negotiations. And those who had chosen the path of armed resistance and of violence and of terror would look at the model on the West Bank and say, that's what we want too. And ultimately, they would have moved in that direction. So let's see where we are at the end of all of this. But the bottom line is, anywhere, anytime that some part of Palestinian society wants to achieve an end of this conflict and wants to set up a state in peace with its neighbor Israel, establish a border and a cooperation on water and economy and security, that's what Israel should aim to do. How can there be an occupation if there was never a Palestine? Well, there was never, quote unquote, any of the states that exist in most of the rest of the world prior to the past century. There's an occupation because there are millions of people who are not Israeli citizens and are living without their own government, without a sense of equal rights, under a military law in a territory that was conquered in a war. So, the definition of an occupation established by the Geneva Conventions is what applies to the territory that Israel won in 1967. So that's what derives this being called an occupation and what we are trying to bring to an end. Forget the moral equivalency. Don't we need to acknowledge the power imbalance? This conflict isn't equal. Well, that is certainly the case. I mean, this is an asymmetric conflict. You have a government with an army and the highest technology available on one side, and you have a non-state actor firing homemade weapons that have no guidance system and could land anywhere on the other. This is a fundamentally asymmetric conflict in a military sense right now, which leads to the casualty figures that you see. But it's also an asymmetric conflict politically, in terms of the Palestinians having very few bargaining chips and Israel having all the cards. So yes, there's an imbalance of power. We need the United States and we need other international actors engaged, providing a more, let's put it as an honest broker kind of a role in trying to work out a political resolution to this conflict than we've had so far. And I see we have about 10 minutes left. Still a couple more questions coming in. If anybody has more questions, please feel free. You can still email them to info@jstreet.org or tweet them at jstreet.org, and I'll keep talking until my voice runs out. How can Israel sustain this Fortress Israel policy? I don't think that they can. I mean, I think that the creation of a state that is living within walls and has an iron dome and essentially hunkers down and just doesn't work out its conflicts with its neighbors is not a formula for long-run success. It is possible to survive on a day-to-day basis, and certainly Iron Dome, we have to thank the United States, those of us who care about Israeli citizens and you know, care about its security, have to thank the United States for the success of Iron Dome, but that's not a long-run policy. It's not a sustainable situation. For Israel to truly be established, legitimate, accepted into the world, it needs to resolve this conflict. It has to have recognized borders. It has to achieve a peace deal with all of its neighbors along the lines of the Arab Peace Initiative, along the lines of the peace with Jordan and Egypt that have held up so well for decades. And that is the ultimate answer. A fortress Israel policy is not a long-run answer. How is it compassionate to say that Arabs should live under corrupt Fatah and Hamas government? Well, you know, all around the world, everybody gets the government that they, you know, are responsible for, and there's lots of really bad governments in the world. There's lots of corruption everywhere in the world, and you know, everybody has that right and freedom and self-determination to have a government that then turns out to be corrupt. So it's not compassionate. I would hope that you know, the Palestinians, who are an extraordinarily well-educated people, who have been exposed to a great deal of Western democracy, Western-style ideas, will pursue and try to create. And I know that the President Mahmoud Abbas and the former Prime Minister, who I know well, Salam Fayyad, were very dedicated to the notion of having a well-functioning, highly functioning, transparent system of government. But obviously there's a long road to go, and I have a lot of confidence in many of the Palestinians that I have met that they're trying to build ultimately a state and a society that they would be proud of, and I know that they recognize the challenges that they have ahead of them. Does J Street have the ear of U.S., Israel, Palestinian administrations? Well, we certainly have access to a large number of the political leaders here in Washington. We certainly have our ideas heard in the current administration and on Capitol Hill. Within Israel, the the part of the government that we do not agree with and that we don't see eye to eye with, generally speaking, doesn't want to meet with us. And that echoes the approach that some in the American Jewish community take to ideas that they don't like, just preferring not to meet with and not to engage. We would disagree with that. We certainly have very good relations with a very large portion of the Israeli Knesset. Just last Wednesday, I was in Israel. I spent the day at the Knesset. I must have met with 15 members of Knesset from 5 different parties, including ministers in the current government. And we meet all the time as well with many of the Palestinian Authority leadership, including President Abbas and other ministers, leadership of the PLO, members of the Palestinian National Legislature. So we have good relationships. We have the ear. The one place that I would say could use some improvement is that I wish that we had a more open door with the Netanyahu administration and with some on the right in his government. Where are the Palestinian moderates? Is there a peace street? My argument, my answer to that is always that the Palestinian moderates is the PA. They don't need a peace street in that sense, in that the partner that we've been asking for, as Shimon Peres has said, as Ehud Olmert has said, as Ehud Barak has said, the partner that we have been asking for is there right now. And the moderates that we need to support are the ones that are actually in power on the West Bank. And to the extent that we don't make a deal with them, to the extent that we don't provide them with support, we're only empowering the extremists on the Palestinian side. I have two together. How do the Iranian negotiations relate to this conflict? What are the risks of an Israel-Iran war? This issue is dominating the news. Does that help or hinder Iran talks? Well, I'm really glad that you asked this question because, as some of you may know, the 6-month deadline for negotiations of a deal between Iran and the world powers called the P5+1, that timetable, that 6 months, comes to an end this coming Sunday, on Sunday, July 20th, and a deal is supposed to be negotiated by next Sunday. Secretary of State Kerry has been in Vienna for the last couple of days. A team of American diplomats, along with teams from all the other countries, basically moved into Vienna at the end of June and has been negotiating nonstop, trying to get to a deal by this coming Sunday. They may end up having to extend that deal beyond Sunday. I don't think that the current conflict is in any way actually affecting the negotiations that are taking place right now in Vienna about the Iranian nuclear program. I would say that the odds seem to be better than 50-50, that there is going to be some form of deal, maybe not by Sunday, but within the coming weeks and months. And here in this country, we're going to have a very significant fight that is going to play out on Capitol Hill as to whether or not the deal that may ultimately be struck is a good enough deal, and whether or not Congress is going to provide the relief of sanctions that would be required under the course of the deal. So it's going to be a big issue for J Street coming up. I'd say that there's a real risk of military conflict between Israel and Iran ultimately if we can't get to a deal over Iran's nuclear program, because either we reach a deal or Iran is just going to keep on progressing towards a nuclear weapon, and Israel is unlikely to accept that progression and could well take military action. So the best way to prevent that situation from spiraling into conflict is to see success in reaching a deal over the course of the next few weeks. We have about 5 minutes left. We have about 2 more questions, and then we'll be at the end of this Google Hangout. What about general volatility in the Arab world with ISIS, etc.? Jordan could be non-existent soon. Absolutely. I mean, the atmosphere in the neighborhood of Israel is absolutely terrible. Obviously, of Syria and Iraq and the situation that's happening there. The ISIS and the other forces are on the border of Jordan. It is a very, very difficult and frightening situation. And the question is, as was asked in a speech that I highly recommend to people by Phil Gordon, who's the director for the Middle East in the National Security Council at the White House. He gave a speech at the Haaretz conference, and he asked the question whether or not a moment like this is the right time to be pursuing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to try to find some even broader regional solution. And the answer is yes, this is the right time, because it's precisely when things are unstable, precisely when there are threats that may in fact bring people together. I think that Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, Israel, the Palestinians, all have a set of common interests in holding back the tide of extremism and finding a way to stand together against some of these forces that are arrayed against them in the region. And so it's precisely at a moment like this, when there is such instability, that Israel and its neighbors should be looking for their common interests, and that may in fact be an incentive to try a regional approach in a post-Gaza, this particular round of conflict, find a regional approach to try to resolve this conflict. Don't the settlements preclude a Palestinian state? The short answer to that is no, they don't preclude a Palestinian state. That every single day that goes by, every new building that's built, every new road that's built, everything that happens to deepen the settlement enterprise makes it that much more difficult to build a Palestinian state. But at the end of the day, everything that is being put in is human-made. Whether it's a building or a fence or a road, it can be unmade. Ultimately, it's the political will that is the most important missing ingredient right now. The presence of physical things is not the obstacle to achieving a two-state solution. The obstacle is the lack of the political decision to draw the border and then withdraw the people and the physical barriers that stand in the way. All right, it's 3:58. This is our last two questions together. Given Bibi's intransigence and the escalating frustrations of Palestinians, can the U.S. realistically do anything to help? Does the U.S. still have the standing credibility to play a constructive role in brokering a cessation of violence? If not the U.S., then who? I mean, the one thing that I have been astounded by is that despite all of the years and despite all of the efforts and despite all of the failures to date, at the end of the day, the entire region still looks up and says there's really only one superpower and there's really only one actor that can bring people to the table with any sense of power, with any sense of credibility, despite all of the failures, and that's the United States. So despite everything that has come before, I think the United States is still an absolutely essential actor. The Europeans are not going to do anything without the United States. Certainly the Israelis will never make any concessions without the United States' either both a combination of the United States pushing them a bit to make some of those concessions, but also guaranteeing their security. So the United States remains an essential player in all of this, and given Bibi's intransigence and the escalating frustrations of Palestinians, is it realistic to think that anything can be done? Well, as I said at the very beginning, American leadership is necessary but not sufficient. There's going to have to be a different Israeli government that has different political leadership, that has a different philosophy and a different strategy. This government has proven that it is not interested in, not truly interested in, a two-state solution, despite mouthing some of the words. There are people in this government who are clearly bent on a one-state solution, who are trying to ensure that there never will be a Palestinian state. And until that changes, until there's a different coalition or a different government altogether, there's probably not much that can be done by the United States. And so a change in Israel politically is one of the things that is going to have to happen over the next few years if there's going to be a resolution to this conflict peacefully. So that's it from Washington, D.C. I hope that this conversation has been informative. I still have part of my voice left, so that's good. I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that I really urge people to look at our statement from last Friday and circulate it to friends, circulate it to listservs, to community institutions. Please visit the Facebook page called Peace Not Revenge, Peace Not Vengeance. That is something we've been promoting. If you're looking for a way to help build the community for peace, to build the community for a peaceful resolution of this conflict, let's build up the number of likes on that page. Let's show there's a real meaningful constituency for peace, and let's hope that within the matter of just a few days, the United States and others will be able to broker a ceasefire that brings this round of hostilities to an end, and that we can begin again the search for a lasting and a durable resolution to this conflict. So thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to working with all